Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Advisor, Risk and Audit at Auditboard, and welcome to another in my continuing series, Agents of Change. I'm joined here today in London by Delwin Witthoft, who has spent the last 9 years at the medical equipment company Philips, where he's currently serving as the head of audit. Welcome to the show, Delwin.
Thanks, Richard. Really happy to be here.
You know, Delwin, this idea of agents of change, we talk a lot about it. I just updated my book on agents of change to a second edition. And I would tell you that the concept behind it is one that recognizes that the traditional role of internal audit as just being the assurance provider, as just sort of hindsight and assurance, has got to change, and that internal audit really has to become more of a transformational element in an organization, bringing forth the ideas and helping the organization conceive of ways that it can transform and improve. What's your assessment of that role for internal audit?
Oh, I fully agree. I think there's an important part that audit has to remain the assurance provider, but at the same time, only hindsight is not going to help the company actually grow and meet the competitive challenges going forward. So auditors are definitely there to do more than the checking. They're there to actually identify opportunities for improvements, and that actually helps organizations move forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would say the era that we're living in, the 2020s in particular, in these first 5 years of the decade, have just been nothing short of phenomenal in terms of how much disruption there's been. We just seem to have lurched from one disruptive event, risk-induced disruptive event, to another, from pandemics to wars to inflation to supply chain issues to talent shortages. It just seems to never end. What do you think internal audit's role is, or could be, or should be, in helping organizations navigate this kind of uncertainty?
And perhaps I'll start by saying internal audit is slightly unique at Philips in that the enterprise risk management team also report into me. So all these risks you mentioned are front and foremost in mind, as we also then not only help the organization identify and act on the risks, but also then use that to inform the annual audit plan, such that we can follow those risks and actually provide the assurance needed to make the changes where we need to make changes and improvements, and also where we need to seize the opportunities.
You talk about that you also have some responsibility for the risk management function. That's not unusual. In fact, in the United States, for example, over 40% of publicly traded companies' internal audit functions also have the risk management function. So, you know, one of the things that does is it facilitates what we call connected risk. It's not the only path to connected risk, but certainly the more connection you have between audit, risk management, and compliance function, and your CISO and others, the more connection you have, the more likely the organization's going to have a connected view of risk. What do you think is the biggest benefit to you and to Philips for you having responsibility for the risk management function?
Well, you know, what you're referring to, I call integrated assurance. And yeah, it is quite interesting because before becoming head of internal audits, I was the chief accounting officer of the company. And there I had the SOX team reporting to me. And I definitely saw the synergies between the SOX team, the enterprise risk management, and now the audit team, where you can really start getting a more holistic view, and then also connecting in with other compliance functions to actually strengthen that view and see, you know, where the areas are. And there's an analysis that we started last year on risk interconnectivity, because not only on the insurance side, where you want to actually have that integrated view of you know, assurance, you also then have a mapping of the risks and how they interplay with each other,
Right.
and also looking at the velocity of which risks are going to hit you first,
Right.
and which are down the line strategic risks that might hit you in 5 years. So all of this has to come together in an assurance provider where you have an annual SOX cycle, but you also then have a longer term audit cycle that has to start catering for risks that will hit you in future.
Absolutely. And so I think from a connected risk standpoint, or the term you were using was
integrated assurance.
Integrated assurance. So sounds like that you guys are on the leading edge of how that challenge is addressed.
Well, let's say there's always more to do, but it's definitely incredibly interesting. And I won't say we're the experts, but definitely investigating the opportunities that come from that.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. We talk about the challenges of the environment we're in. The number one challenge chief audit executives talk about, and the thing that quote unquote keeps them awake at night, is really their talent. Finding and retaining that right talent. Internal auditors who have expertise in key technologies, maybe have expertise in the business. How do you, as a head of internal audit, how do you navigate that?
Well, I'll start by saying, as audit is a people business, and you're quite right. That is my number one challenge, is to get the right people through the departments. We still have a 100% rotational department of our auditors, so that means that every 3 or 4 years you need to find the new talent from the businesses, functions, and regions to actually come in, learn our methodology, spend time to actually identify the opportunities, and then move back into the business, market, or function. And that is really a challenge. But I'll also say that perhaps some recent events have actually created opportunities, because a lot of people are slightly scared of coming into audit because of the heavy travel burden.
Right.
Whereas actually now that we've moved a lot more into a hybrid way of working, a lot more people are suddenly interested, saying actually that could be great because they can work from wherever they're located, and they travel then, rather than for 3 or 4 weeks at a row, they travel perhaps for 1 week to do the site visit, because obviously proximity remains important, but you can actually do a lot remotely, and that has really been an opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point, because the whole concept of remote work, hybrid work, whatever terms you want to use, has fundamentally altered the whole talent landscape, and so it sounds like for you maybe it's actually helping in some ways, rather than being an impediment. It actually helps you to get the right talent.
No, it's definitely had a positive impact, and it's actually quite interesting that the transition actually happened incredibly smoothly. I thought it would be quite problematic. I became the head of audit in the middle of the pandemic, and after first dealing with the challenges of actually closing the quarter under the pandemic, I then moved into running a global audit team,
Right.
in a non-travel environment. So it was incredibly interesting. But it was really amazing how flexible people were and how quickly that change was adopted.
So you've sort of dated your joining the CAE role as to kind of back to the beginning of the decade. So you've been in this role through all of the disruption that we've been talking about. So how do not, I have two questions. Number one, how did your background in the business help you as the chief audit executive? What advantage do you think that gave you coming into the internal audit role, that you knew the business because you had served in other roles?
Well, firstly, on talent, so you have to have that connection and that network within the organization to know who the stakeholders are on the one side, and also where the talent is on the other, that you can then bring into the internal audit organization. And then secondly, it's also to understand the risks, because as I mentioned, I also have responsibility for enterprise risk management, and you need to have some proximity to what we're doing, what challenges we're facing, what our stakeholders are expecting, and what our regulators are expecting, to actually then make that transition.
So I would think you also had the relationships at very senior levels of the company that were already sort of pre-formed, and you could import those into your current role.
Indeed, and I think the most important relationship there is with the audit committee, because as chief accounting officer, I attended all the audit committee meetings where the head of audit at the time was reporting out. So actually the transition from one chair to another perhaps was slightly easier than it might have been for someone that comes to that cold.
Yeah, because someone who comes to it cold often has to build the credibility with the audit committee. They have to build the relationships and the credibility, and that takes a little bit of time, but you were able to hit the ground running. So the other part of my question then is, you've been in that role through all of the disruption that we've seen. How do you think internal audit under your leadership, how do you think it's helped the company address some of the disruptive forces that at work?
Yeah, so perhaps not only the macro disruptive forces, perhaps you've read in the press, Philips has been going through a very tough time recently, and it's been really, really interesting in that it's actually put a lot more onus on audit being that change maker that you referred to in the beginning of the discussion, because it's not only just checking that the basics are there, but also helping to identify the areas of improvement, and also looking at all the transformational projects that have been put in place to improve quality, to address legacy issues, and also to get the company ready for the future. Right. Because I think everything is coming together at once. You have a much more competitive landscape in the business side. You have a higher expectation from stakeholders, including regulators. And at the same time, internally, you have to drive that productivity that you need. So all of this has to come together, and audit, I think, is an excellent opportunity to actually spot the opportunities in this network of events to see how the company can actually move forward. Right. And perhaps an enabler that we haven't touched on yet is technology, because I think that is going to be a really important element going forward to actually make this all work.
You mentioned technology, so I don't go a day without somebody wanting my thoughts about technology, in particular about AI, and AI's prominence and what I think the future holds in terms of a relationship, if you will, between internal audit and AI. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we're at an early part of that journey. I mean, at Philips, AI is already built into some of our medical products, so it's not an untried area. But in internal audit, we're now just starting to experiment now to see what the opportunities are. And also, I've connected with a lot of peers from other companies, and I think a lot of them are at the same stage now of seeing, how can AI actually make our lives better. And then I think the real opportunity comes in perhaps better coverage going forward, because in the past audit is around a sampling methodology, right, whereas actually with computing power and AI, you can actually sample 100% of the population, right, and that could actually give you much different insights, and actually mean that the time the auditors spend is then on that solutioning of a problem into a fix, rather than working out what has gone wrong.
I think the future of AI and internal audit, I think, is truly phenomenal. I think we have an exciting journey ahead, and I'm anxious to be there to see how it plays out, and hopefully to offer some insights along the way. And I'm sure you are as well.
No, indeed. It's going to be interesting times ahead, because technology is an opportunity, but also then triggers some challenges in that we have to then get the right talent in that understands the technology and can actually then express a view on is it being used correctly? Are we meeting all the regulatory requirements? Mm-hmm. And is the outcome actually the correct outcome?
Right. Yeah. Well, Delwin, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your insights, and I look forward to seeing how your journey plays out in Philips and beyond.
Thanks so much, Richard. Lovely being here.
And thank you for joining me in another episode of Agents of Change.